You're watching CNBC Africa, and this is the intersection of money and power. Welcome to Political Capital. My name is Karabole Tlhatla. It's the big story of the day, a day that will live in infamy in South Africa. We're talking about the Marikana Massacre, where police gunned down 34 miners on strike at the Lonmin Platinum Mine, 141 kilometers away from Johannesburg. No one has been held accountable. Families of the victims are still awaiting compensation, and we continue to wait for the ruling party, the ANC, and the President Cyril Ramaphosa to keep his promise and go to Marikana. Later in the show, we'll be crossing to our reporter from Marikana Kopi, where the police shot those miners. But first, is the other big story of the week, probably the biggest political story. For the second time in 6 years, the Constitutional Court, the highest court in South Africa, has ruled that the appointment of the head of the National Prosecuting Authority to be invalid. In spectacular fashion, former NPA boss Shaun Abrahams was ordered out. Was Shaun Abrahams merely collateral damage from the downfall of former President Jacob Zuma? I compiled this report.
After consideration of the matter, I am of the view that there are reasonable prospects of a successful prosecution of Mr. Zuma on the charges listed in the indictment served on Mr. Zuma prior to the termination of the matter by Mshe SC. As a result, Mr. Zuma's representations are unsuccessful.
A bright spot on a dull career. March 15th this year, South Africa's former head of prosecutions, Shaun Abrahams, made his most telling announcement. It had long been said how former President Zuma had tried to avoid his day in the dock over corruption charges. But now, the man who was supposed to shield him was charging him. The sad part is, he had little choice. Abrahams had failed to make this announcement since taking over the reins of the prosecuting agency in 2015, with most analysts saying it is the reason he got the job in the first place. But now the Constitutional Court has ruled that former President Zuma erred in the manner he fired his last chief prosecutor, Mqolisi, with a fat golden handshake of 17 million rands.
In the result, the following order is made. 1. The appeal of Mr. Mqolisi Sandile Oliver Nxasana is upheld with no order as to costs, and Mr. Nxasana's explanatory affidavit is admitted. 2. The costs order by the High Court of South Africa, Gauteng Division, Pretoria, against Mr. Nxasana is set aside. 3. The appeal of Advocate Shaun Kevin Abrahams and the National Prosecuting Authority is dismissed with costs, including the costs of 2 counsel. 4. The declaration by the High Court that the settlement agreement dated 14 May 2015 concluded by former President Jacob Zuma, the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, and Mr. Nxasana, in terms of which Mr. Nxasana's incumbency as the National Director of Public Prosecutions was terminated, is constitutionally invalid, is confirmed. The declaration by the High Court that the termination of the appointment of Mr. Nxasana as NDPP is constitutionally invalid is confirmed.
The Apex Court declared Shaun Abrahams' subsequent appointment as chief prosecutor also invalid. Abrahams was yet another victim of Zuma's collateral damage. But does anyone feel sorry for him?
I don't feel sorry for him at all, not one bit. I think he knew when he took that position that he should have known that he was being appointed invalidly. And, under the circumstances, anybody who was promoted from the sort of middle ranks of the NPA to the top job in the NPA knew precisely why he was being appointed, and he has conducted himself in the manner appropriate to his appointment. So I have no sympathy for him at all.
The Constitutional Court ruling was wider reaching than that. It also ruled that former Chief Prosecutor Mqolisi, who was in court on the day, to pay back 10 of the 17 million rands Zuma paid him to go away.
I was hoping that the court will say I must repay the money and reinstate me. From a personal point of view, what I find unfair is that when I had not done anything wrong, and this court, if I had the justice correctly, they came to a conclusion that it would not be just and equitable to reinstate me because they assume that the president might decide to institute an inquiry into my fitness because I was part to the unlawful settlement. Again, I felt hard done by that presupposition because, again, it takes away my right to explain how did it come about that I ultimately succumbed to that pressure.
As part of the judgment, the president was given 90 days to appoint a permanent head of prosecutions, but the courts had a caveat. It also wants Parliament to amend the way in which prosecution bosses are appointed.
So there's no checks and balances. And then the other problem is, of course, that so far we have mostly selected people for political reasons and because of political loyalties. And that is probably not a good thing because it's a very difficult job to have because you have to make decisions that are going to be politically very unpopular, both with the politicians and, of course, also with the people with a lot of money, the powerful individuals who don't pay their taxes, the cigarette smugglers, all those type of people. So there will be people who want to undermine you. And if you're not a strong-willed person, a person who doesn't really have loyalties to a political party or financial interest, you are not really going to do your job properly, and that is the problem.
Since the establishment of the National Prosecuting Authority in 1998, there have been a revolving doors for chief prosecutors. In the 20 years of its existence, none has actually finished their 10-year term of office. Dlamini-Zuma had the longest stint in that office, lasting for 6 years before resigning. In 2003, Zuma famously announced that his team had evidence of corruption against then Deputy President Jacob Zuma. But in his own words, the case was unwinnable. Busi Piccoli was up next, the man famous for charging disgraced former police commissioner Jackie Selebi. Former President Thabo Mbeki would later fire Piccoli, citing a breakdown in relationship, whatever that means. Then Mokotedi Mshe was appointed to act as head of the agency in 2007. And in 2009, Mshe surprised many when he announced he would be dropping corruption charges against then ANC President Jacob Zuma, paving the way for Zuma to become president. In 2009, Menzi Simelane was appointed permanently. But the Constitutional Court would rule in 2012 that Simelane's appointment was invalid. The courts said that Zuma ignored adverse findings by the Public Service Commission report, questioning Simelane's fitness to hold the office. Zuma then called on Nomgcobo Jiba to act in Simelane's stead as the head of the prosecuting agency in 2012. But her checkered past and previous suspension from the prosecuting agency made hers a fleeting stay. In 2013, Zuma appointed Mxolisi Nxasana as the new head of the NPA, but following internal battles within the prosecuting agency, Zuma instituted a commission over Nxasana's fitness to hold office. A few months later, Zuma paid Nxasana 17.3 million rands to walk away. Sean Abrams became the prosecution's boss in 2016. Widely regarded as a Zuma-leki, Abrams threatened to charge former Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan over fraud, charges which were later dropped in ignominy. Many accused Abrams of sitting on his hands while billions of rands were looted through state capture. Now, Silas Ramaite is the acting boss of prosecutions, but there are growing calls for former public protector, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, to come in the long term.
You look for a person with integrity who is beyond reproach. That's what you look for. You look for a smart lawyer, and those people exist. You know, I could think of one or two candidates. I'm not going to say who I think they are now, but I think they exist. And you don't have to go, searching for somebody who will do your bidding. In fact, that's precisely what should not be done. And that's why I say the appointment processes need to be revised.
Well, like many people, I have a lot of respect for Thuli Madonsela, but she has already done a job. I don't think she would want to have this job, and I don't think one should maybe look at somebody else, somebody like her, somebody who is politically aware, politically astute, progressive, but is not beholden to anyone and is fearless. That is the kind of person you want.
All of South Africa's chief prosecutors have either been tainted or sucked under by the Jacob Zuma corruption charges. The next to take over the reins at the National Prosecuting Authority better do their homework and the right thing by long-suffering taxpayers. So, Silas Ramaite is the acting head in the NPA. In the search for a new head, will Parliament heed the caveat ordered by the Constitutional Court to amend the manner in which it appoints the head of prosecuting agency? And how likely is it that the next appointment will be free of political considerations? I spoke to Mfesani Kasiboto of the Johannesburg Society of Advocates. What do you think is the best way of choosing the NPA head? Do you think that the Judicial Service Commission must be part of this, or do you think it should be solely a parliamentary process like we're seeing when we appoint a public protector?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. A lot of commentators have suggested that it should be a parliamentary process where involve other members of other political parties as a safeguard, such that power is not abused by the president or the governing party. As to the Judicial Service Commission, it's a difficult one because it's largely a political appointment as much as it is a legal one. One would hope that it becomes less political and more legal. But I certainly think the process that is being followed to appoint the public protector is perhaps the base safeguard.
When you look at the names that have occupied this office, from Bulani Nguga, Menzi Simelane, Mkolisi Ngasana to Sean Abrams, you are hard-pressed to find a dominant female voice, barring Nomkobojiba, who's acted in that position. But do you think we have avenue to break with tradition and break with some of the already compromised people inside the NPA?
The president will be well advised to do that because you don't know how far the rot deepens within the NPA and how many people are compromised already. With that being said, again, it's the prerogative of the president to look into the fitness of the person, because ultimately that's what we care about. I mean, there's been suggestion that Advocate Thuli Madonsela should take up the position. I think it's a valid call, but it's for the president to decide.
When I think about the president, it's hard to forget the Marikana Massacre and some of the liability that is still to this day alleged to be on his part. I have reservations with giving that man the prerogative of appointing the next head of prosecutions. I mean, if he didn't have something outstanding, maybe I wouldn't feel as strongly as I do.
Well, we would be advised to remember that he's never been found guilty.
But it never has he been tried.
But then again, and it's a valid question, because the issue of politics is not just what you can prove as a matter of law, it's a moral question as well, it's a political question. It's a question about confidence in the #1 citizen in a country, so the question is certainly valid. This is precisely why now Parliament has been given a task to look into how you appoint an NPA head. It certainly should not rest on an individual, and they keep saying this over and over again. The Constitution was enacted and drafted in the manner it has been, envisaging Nelson Mandela as a president, supposedly because it was a moral high ground, and now we compromise because we have now the period where we wish we never had under the rule of the former President Jacob Zuma. So I agree it shouldn't rest with one individual, certainly not a politician. So we're looking to see what Parliament is going to come up with, and hopefully they do fix the problem.
What is the likelihood that Parliament will actually come up with a process before the 90-day period is over? Are we likely to have a president appoint the last head of public prosecutions, or could we actually hope for Parliament intervention here?
Well, Parliament is in recess until September. So it's very unlikely that any policies and legislation will be passed, or rather the amendment to the NPA Act will be made before the 90-day period lapses. So in all likelihood, the President will appoint a permanent head of the NPA before Parliament even begins its work on amending the NPA Act.
After the break, we're going into the murky world of mining, from lives lost to jobs lost. More on the other side of this.